I'm Callista.
And I'm Teresa, and this is Terrifyingly Typical True Crime.
We're continuing with our theme on religious leaders who kill family members, with another man who was cheating on his wife with a female member of his congregation. If this is starting to feel repetitive, we feel you. But in this case, the woman the youth pastor started sleeping with before his wife's murder just so happened to predict her death. Bainbridge Island, Washington is a little over 27 square miles and only a 35-minute ferry ride from Seattle. It's known for its rocky shoreline, forested hills, and a population of around 25,000. But as the millennium approached, the island gained fame for far more sinister reasons. Bainbridge Island's Christ Community Church was a brown single-story building on a low hill. But underneath the unassuming pitched roof, its congregation believed in the super spiritual phenomena of receiving prophecies and messages from the man above. Nick Hacheney, the youth pastor for this devout community, was one lucky recipient of God's messages. And Nick Hacheney decided that God, in his infinite wisdom, was telling him to kill his wife, Dawn. Or, at least, that's the story he would later try to sell to his mistress. To understand what the hell happened, let's go back to the beginning.
As was fitting for the wife of a pastor, Dawn Marie Tinahara grew up in a religious household. Her mother remembered her daughter quoting scriptures at bedtime when she was just 4 years old. As she grew older, whatever Dawn achieved, such as traveling to Washington, D.C. for the National Spelling Bee when she represented her home state of Washington at the age of 12, or becoming valedictorian of her high school, she felt she owed to God, saying, "I give God the glory for my accomplishments because without him, I could not have remained strong and faithful." As her childhood came to an end, Dawn started to show a special kind of insight. When she and her best friend Eunice Cody were at different colleges, Dawn seemed to know what Eunice was doing without ever being told, calling when her friend was doing something ill-advised to warn her to stop. And I wonder how much Eunice appreciated that.
I know. I guess it depends how ill-advised those plans were on a scale of typical teenage stupidity to life-alteringly idiotic.
That's a good point. Whether she picked up the phone because she knew her friend's habits or because she had a sixth sense, one day Dawn called Eunice for a different reason. During this conversation, Dawn told her friend that she'd met someone who shared her religious devotion, a boy named Nick Hacheney. Dawn went on to marry the man she called a knight on April 20th, 1990. Only a couple of years after they exchanged vows, Nick was more than happy to become the youth pastor of Christ Community Church. After all, its founder, Pastor Bob Smith, had been the one to marry him and Dawn.
Nick had known he had a God-given destiny for as long as he could remember. When he became ill as a baby, his parents raced their young son to the hospital, and his father prayed, "God, take my boy and raise him, and he will be yours forever." Nick took his survival to mean that God himself had intervened on his behalf. It was only natural that Nick decided to devote his life to his holy savior. In the mid-1990s, Nick and Dawn joined Christ Community Church's senior pastors, Robert Biley Craig and Bob Smith. Youth Pastor Nick eagerly accepted this new role to help shepherd his growing flock. His affability and authenticity added to the church's close-knit family feel, and he enthusiastically welcomed the church's newest members. Two such members included a couple named Annette and Craig Anderson, who became part of the congregation in the hope that this larger community would benefit their growing family. In fact, it was almost as if they were gaining a sort of extended family. When the Andersons' daughter Grace was born in 1997, Nick and Dawn were there to hold her only minutes after she was delivered. Nick even did his first solo baby dedication for her.
Although Nick and Dawn wanted children of their own, As opposed to most of the other young couples in the church, they were waiting to start their family until they were in a better financial position. Nick didn't earn much as a youth pastor, so Dawn, who worked as a loan officer at a credit union, supported them. Although most of the other female members of the church didn't work and many homeschooled their children, both Nick and Dawn seemed to be happy with the arrangement, even if her career meant that she had to miss church events like the retreats or youth group meetings her husband played a major role in. While this led some to feel bad for her, Nick and Dawn appeared to be in love and happy with their shared life. Dawn upheld the secondary supportive role she was expected to play. She never questioned Nick's decisions, like when he spent the money she was earning on other congregants or put his relationship with her last. And I assume that was because she was subservient to him as their religion dictated.
That's definitely the impression I got.
But soon after Nick and Dawn joined the church, the couple and the entire congregation experienced a change in their community. Annette and Craig Anderson had known that they were joining a different kind of church, one that embraced super spirituality in the form of witnessing manifestations of God and ridding their members of demons. But the emotionally charged atmosphere turned a shade darker when it began to stray even farther from mainstream Christian beliefs. In isolating its members, it made them dependent on the church.
Which to me sounds incredibly coal like.
It certainly does. But this was years before the Boston Globe unveiled the rampant child sex abuse within the Catholic Church. So people like Annette and Craig had less reason to distrust Christ Community Church and its leaders. And if you're interested in a movie, not a documentary, about the Boston Globe's investigation, the 2015 movie Spotlight, it's really good.
Definitely. Speaking of those leaders, by the year of Dawn's death, Pastor Bob Smith, the warm hearted founder of Christ Community Church, who had asked Nick to join them, had been usurped by Pastor Robert Biley Craig, a biblical scholar. Biley saw himself as an apostle tasked with upholding the sanctity of Scripture by ensuring that each successive generation was following it to the letter. He arrived at the church in 1990 and planned to remain for only a short period. But having stayed on to serve for around 7 years, he was voted to the position of senior minister. The church's new leader would hold sermons that lasted hours, during which members would speak in tongues. And after the service, altar calls would be held in which congregants presented themselves for healing as they continued to cry out in an indecipherable language. Senior Minister Biley started a series of private counseling sessions led by himself, Bob, and Nick, in which members of the church begged for the demons inside them to be exorcised as they were yelled at and prayed over. While they were in this concerning condition, the pastors would attempt to expose their sins by asking if they drank excessively, cheated on their partners, or attended a baseball game, which I guess was bad because you're socializing with others who don't belong to the church. And the pastors didn't just listen to these confessions, they recorded them all in a book.
Drinking, cheating, and attending a baseball game were all equally bad. I mean, and it's probably just me, but it doesn't seem like these confessions should be kept in a book to possibly use against a member in the future.
I'm not sure if there was a hierarchy to the sins, but I also thought of that book's potential for blackmail. Although, to be fair, I didn't see anything about it being used for that purpose.
But then why write it down?
I guess just so that the threat hangs over them.
Good point.
Understandably, the members lived in a state of fear. This fear entrenched them even more deeply in the congregation for worry that their departure from the church would cause gossip.
As for why the congregants consented to this counseling, Annette Anderson said she believed this transparency was a way to please God. Her husband, Craig, added that no one wanted to have demons inside them, and these sessions banished them. And it's not as if there was an actual choice to opt out. If a member tried to avoid this unpleasant activity, they would be said to have a demon of rebellion inside of them. Beyond that, they believed following their church leaders' instructions was the right thing to do. So they believed every parishioner needed counseling and they all had demons?
I guess the demons had found quite a hunting ground.
Apparently, like we mentioned earlier, demonic possessions weren't the extent of the congregation's super spiritual interactions because God Himself deigned to share prophecies with His chosen few. He spoke frequently to one special congregant named Sandra, or Sandy Glass. The 30 something married church secretary had been in contact with him for years and was kind enough to recount these prophecies to her fellow churchgoers. Over their relationship, God had warned her that one of her children would be born prematurely, but would be all right. And he was right. When God advised her to get a new car, it turned out to serve her well. And God wasn't her only visitor. The angel Gabriel, who had told the Virgin Mary that she would become the mother of Jesus Christ, had come to see Sandy as well.
Given how well God's predictions had worked out for Sandy, when he warned her and a couple of other members that Seattle would soon be decimated by an earthquake, the congregation took action. Church leaders knew Seattle was on a major fault line. So, after having a council and board meeting and making smaller changes, like altering their travel routes, thousands of dollars were spent on stockpiling food for an earthquake that never came. Even though few of the families who belonged to Christ Community Church had, as most don't, money to waste on food for a potential natural disaster, they took Sandy at her word when she gave them God's warning. And although it didn't come to pass, their faith in Sandy never wavered.
I mean, so did God and Sandy get their wires crossed?
It sure seems like it, or at least there was some static on the line or something.
It's great.
But Sandy didn't announce all of the messages she received from the man above to the entire congregation. When in the fall of 1997, God predicted that Dawn's death would pave the way for Sandy to become Nick's new partner, she told the only person she trusted with this information, Nick.
Well, color me shocked. It's almost like Sandy decided she wanted to be with Nick, and so she said God sent her a message.
It is rather convenient, isn't it? In response to this startling declaration, Nick didn't show surprise. Instead, he said he was already aware of this upcoming spousal switcheroo. Nick didn't share the explicit details of this prophecy with the other members, but he did make vague references to it when he told Annette that God would be putting him through some trying times. Selfless as he was, Nick said that no one else should worry about what was to befall him.
Hmm. Around the time of Sandy's prophecy concerning Dawn, the cracks in the couple's relationship became visible to those outside of their marriage. Annette remembered Dawn crying on multiple occasions and witnessed her becoming upset at a baby shower when she confessed that she was trying to drop a few pounds to catch Nick's interest and attempting to improve her cooking to lure her absent husband back home. Poor Dawn. This makes me sad.
Me too.
Dawn was doing all she could to save her marriage, but that didn't mean much when she was the only one making the attempt. When Annette asked about his struggling wife, Nick would simply respond that Dawn's life was going according to God's plan. It seemed that God had Nick and his wife on separate paths because Nick had been away from home even more since he had been tasked with offering marriage counseling to other young couples at Christ Community Church. And one of the couples Nick was helping happened to be Annette and Craig Anderson.
When he first began counseling them in early 1997, Nick's personable nature seemed to be having a positive effect as he led them to explore the deep seated problems in their marriage. After the first session, Nick said he needed to see Annette on her own,
I mean, of course he did.
a pastor using his trusted position to maneuver his way into the life of a vulnerable woman.
Always.
I know, we've never seen that before. But at the time, Nick seemed to be helping them. So the couple had no reason to object. Nick then kept insisting that he needed to meet with Annette one on one. And in one of these sessions, He told her that she didn't trust God enough. The solution was simple. All Lynette needed to do was fall backwards and let Nick catch her. They stood in his office, and after Annette fell into the pastor's arms, he said that God worked the same way. He would always catch her when she fell. She just needed to have faith.
Alrighty.
As for how that would help her relationship with Craig is anyone's guess. Normally, a trust exercise is something couples do with each other to, learn to trust one another. Generally, falling into their married pastor's arms on their own isn't a part of the healing process. Instead, Nick was teaching Annette to rely on him, not her husband, all in the name of improving her relationship with God.
He's such a manipulative shit.
And he will continue to be. Nick kept drawing Annette closer to him, even calling to say that she had the honor of being in his prayer circle.
And Annette wasn't the only married woman Nick was meeting with on her own. Nick would often tell Dawn that he had to go to the mainly female members of Christ Community Church in their hour of spiritual need. While her husband was away, Dawn babysat the children of the women he was counseling, which is just really messed up.
Again, poor Dawn.
Yeah. Dawn never argued when Nick said they needed to use their money to pay for religious retreats for others. Instead of complaining about going to bed alone at night, she'd make meals for the other parishioners, drive Nick home, or drop off supplies. But even though she understood that she had married a man who needed to prioritize his flock, that didn't mean she didn't miss her husband. Still, when Nick was supposedly out helping those in their congregation, Dawn did what she had always done. She supported him. Saint Dawn.
And tragically, like many saints, she wouldn't get a happy ending.
How true. Others were less willing to overlook all the time Nick was spending with married women on his own. Pastor Robert Biley Craig, the new leader, had received complaints from the parents of a man whose wife was having her own one on one meetings with Nick. Having discovered that Nick was spending an awful lot of time with her, Biley knew something was off. Who was this married woman? None other than prophetess Sandy Glass.
At the beginning of 1997, Sandy and her husband Jimmy had both been attending counseling sessions with Nick to work on their marriage. A couple of months later, they were going to meetings both separately and together. Then in the summer, Sandy confessed to Nick that she was attracted to him. Nick responded in kind by kissing her in his office one day.
Always in the church office.
Always. You can't beat the convenience. A few months later, when Dawn was still very much alive, Nick and Sandy went on a drive together. Nick pulled over and they had sex. From then on, they hooked up wherever they could get away with it. In a parked car, in the church office, at Sandy's house, and in the church sanctuary.
Very classy, but it's what God wanted, right?
Of course, they've both been chosen by him. How could they not be meant to be together? But although they thought no one knew, the gossip about the pair among the parishioners led Jimmy's parents to call Pastor Robert Biley Craig. Biley wasn't positive what was going on between the two, but whatever it was raising eyebrows, and it needed to end. The same day Biley received this call, he knew it was up to him as senior minister to keep the peace. So he warned Nick to leave Sandy alone. Nick initially agreed, but he had no intention of following his superior's orders. Biley would later say that he hadn't even known Nick was holding marriage counseling sessions since that fell outside his purview as a youth pastor. To me, I don't think that sounds very likely since Biley was the church leader at this point, but I get why he'd say that once he knew that Nick was using these counseling sessions to prey upon the married women.
I mean, he certainly couldn't acknowledge it.
This is true.
Around the time of Biley's intervention, God started giving Sandy specifics about the future of her relationship with Nick. He told her that they would be a real couple after his wife of 7 years died on December 18th, 1997. And you can't get much more specific than that.
Not unless he provided a time, too.
Once Nick's wife was out of the way, the two would get married and embark on their shared God given destiny. Although it seems to us that Sandy never received any such prophecy and was likely influenced by Nick, Pastor Robert Biley Craig believed that she had an entirely different source. He had come a long way from viewing Sandy's prophetic power as a biblical gift of the Holy Spirit. He now leaned towards Sandy having been influenced by demons or even Satan himself. The pastor knew all too well how dark forces could lead people to evil. He had made an entire career out of it. How very convenient.
It's funny how we can find a way to change our narrative to suit our needs.
I mean, always. Whether she was gifted with second sight or simply knew the people around her better than anyone realized, just as Dawn had known to call her best friend in college to prevent her from making a bad decision. As 1997 was drawing to a close, Dawn seemed to sense something coming. December 18th might have not held any danger for her, but her reprieve was short lived. And Christmas Eve was another far more sinister than festive story.
Late that evening, Dawn called that same best friend, seemingly desperate to talk. When Eunice finally got home from work, she listened to the voicemail in which Dawn said, "We need to get together for dinner. We need to do it soon. Call me." Given the late hour, Eunice decided she would call Dawn back in the morning. But it seemed that Dawn's intuition had rubbed off on Eunice because the following morning, she had her own foreboding feeling that something awful was coming, a premonition that would be proven right. On the last night of Dawn's life, she abandoned the Christmas festivities to make the following ominous statement to her father: "If I were to die, I'm ready." Dawn had made peace with death, safe in the knowledge that the life she had lived had earned her a one-way ticket to heaven. Early in the morning of December 26th, 1997, Nick Hackney left the couple's home in Bremerton, Washington, which, like Bainbridge Island, is a ferry ride from downtown Seattle, to meet Lindsay Latzbow and Phil Martini at the Hood Canal Bridge to go on the duck hunting trip they had made plans for the day before. Just after 7 that morning, one of the Hackney's neighbors noticed smoke billowing from Nick and Dawn's home. It took only 5 minutes for Engine 3 from the Bremerton Fire Department to arrive on the scene. Firefighters made quick work of the blaze and found that the destruction was isolated to the primary bedroom. The entire house might not have been decimated, but the damage to this one room was catastrophic. The ceiling joists had turned black and were on the verge of collapsing. Worse by far, the unrecognizable, severely burned body of Nick's wife, 28-year-old Dawn Hacheney, was discovered lying on the bed, near an electric space heater and several canisters of propane.
At around 10:15 that morning, 27-year-old Nick Hackney pulled up in front of his smoking house to learn of the body found in the bedroom. With his head in his hands, Nick said he knew who it must belong to. As soon as Pastor Robert Biley Craig ended the call in which he learned of Dawn's death, he left his home to go to the Hackneys and see Nick. Once there, he couldn't help but notice that Nick's behavior was bizarre from the off. When Biley went a step really more like a leap further in trying to comfort his bereaved colleague, a few hours later by referencing their ministry associates in African countries like Tanzania who had brought the dead back to life and suggesting that they pray together to see if God would be willing to resurrect Dawn. Nick, far from grasping at this last chance to be reunited with his beloved wife, resolutely rejected the offer. And if you're inclined to be charitable and say this was simply too much for Nick to buy into, it wasn't as if this fell outside of Christ Community Church's belief system. So saying no wasn't about finding the idea unbelievable, it was about not wanting to bring his wife back.
The Bremerton police, on the other hand, were shown a different, much more heartbroken side of Nick when they questioned him after Dawn was found. After they came right out and asked Nick if he had killed her, he denied it, then told them what he thought had happened. According to Nick, On the day before her murder, he and Dawn had gone to a Christmas party and come home late that evening. Nick said that he and Dawn had unwrapped their Christmas presents and had left the gifts in the bedroom where they opened them.
Which is odd, right? Don't you open presents in front of the Christmas tree?
It is odd, but I think that's because most of the house was under renovation. And since the couple had been in the process of home renovations and couldn't turn on the heat, before heading out on the trip the following morning, Nick, hoping Dawn would wake up warmer than he had, turned on the space heater, in front of which the wrapping paper from their Christmas presents lay.
That's convenient and not at all a fire danger.
Right? Some propane canisters, which, according to various sources, Nick had either been storing or which were Christmas presents, were also nearby.
I mean, that has to be one of the lamest things I have ever heard. Not that the propane tanks were stored in the bedroom, I mean, which I have never heard of, but propane tanks as a gift? He could have just doused the room in lighter fluid and lit a match instead of attempting this batshit crazy explanation.
It's not the best cover story I've ever heard, but Nick is used to people buying whatever he's selling. As the questioning continued, Nick said he felt guilty for not foreseeing the wrapping paper getting too close to the heater and starting the fire. He claimed to have loved his wife so much that he just didn't know how he'd cope.
As for why Dawn hadn't moved from the bed, her mother knew that she had had a cold on Christmas and was taking the allergy medication Benadryl. And Nick, who remembered Dawn waking up in the night and taking more, assumed that his wife's sensitivity to the medication must have prevented her from waking in time to escape the blaze. Unaware of Sandy Glass's prophecy, the police believed Nick's story. It made sense that the youth pastor had turned on the space heater. Their home was closer to a construction zone than a house in the midst of their remodel. So, of course, they were doing all they could to get by without central heat that winter. When it came to the autopsy findings, the Kitsap County medical examiner, Dr. Emmanuel Laxina, discovered no soot in either Dawn's lungs or trachea. Instead, she had pulmonary edema. This buildup of fluid in the lungs can be caused by a head injury, drowning, congestive heart failure, a drug overdose, or asphyxiation. In light of these findings, Dr. Laxina suspected that Dawn had already been dead before the fire burned through their bedroom. So he took lung and blood samples and sent them away for toxicology testing.
A Washington State Patrol, or WSP, crime laboratory toxicologist named Egil Weiss performed the tests and found no carbon monoxide in the samples of either her blood or lungs, no cyanide in her blood, and no traces of propane in her lung tissue, meaning that Dawn was no longer breathing when the fire began. However, she did find a high level of diphenhydramine, Benadryl's main ingredient, in her blood. Still, the investigations conducted by both the insurance company and the police ruled that neither Dawn's death nor the fire were intentional. Although one investigator felt uneasy about that determination, without evidence of foul play, less than a month after Dawn's death, Dr. Laxina was left to determine that Dawn's larynx must have spasmed and closed reflexively because of the flash fire and resulted in her dying from asphyxiation.
Is that a thing?
Apparently, he concluded that a leaky propane tank could have exploded and contributed to the high instant heat seen in a flash fire, causing Dawn's throat to close so that no soot could enter her lungs.
Annette learned of Dawn's accidental death when a friend from church called her while she and Craig were at her mother's home in Oregon. They went back to Bremerton to Pastor Bob's house, where mourners came throughout the day to support their youth pastor. As the entire congregation grieved John's death, Nick seemed to be dealing with the loss remarkably well. He seemed tired, but he appeared to be at peace with what had happened and had it in him to greet every person who showed up, Rather than finding this suspicious, church members like the Andersons thought his continued devotion to his faith and flock was inspiring. Thinking of his chosen status, Annette couldn't help but remember Nick's earlier references to some kind of vague trouble that God had in store for him. When she asked Nick if this was what he had been referring to, just as he had before, Nick wouldn't provide specifics. She took his silence as confirmation that he had foreseen his wife's passing and marveled at his relationship with God.
Nick's composure and faith remained on display at Dawn's funeral. Given the large number of people who wanted to attend, it wasn't held at Christ Community Church, but a larger one. During the ceremony, Nick held it together, saying he couldn't feel sad because Dawn was in heaven now.
Not even a little bit?
You would think a single tear might be apropos, but clearly our faith isn't as strong as Nick's.
Thankfully.
After Dawn's funeral service, the church members were having coffee when Nick effusively hugged Annette. Even though Nick was known to be a hugger, he was so enthusiastic in this instance that someone else mentioned it being a bit much to her. Then Nick made her even more uncomfortable when he introduced her to a few of his mom's friends as Dawn's very best friend, which Annette would never have claimed to be. She and Dawn just didn't know each other well enough for that kind of label. If Nick was acting oddly, though, surely that was to be expected. He was going through a lot. His marriage, his home, and everything in it had gone up in flames at the same time. And in his hour of need, the church rallied around him.
One day while Nick was staying at Pastor Bob's house, Annette came over to take care of the insurance company paperwork. Despite Annette having called him out on the many hugs he had given her over the past few weeks, he pulled her into his arms once more when she arrived. She told him to stop and tried to draw him back to why she had come. But unlike Annette, Nick didn't have the practicalities in mind. Although he apologized and said he couldn't help it, he proceeded to lie on the couch with his blanket like a child.
Right.
Instead of helping Annette with the forms, he once again said he couldn't help himself. Then he took it a step further. He added that he couldn't stop thinking about kissing her. Having just read the book Nick's mom recommended about a man whose wife and child died, Annette knew that Nick was behaving bizarrely because of his grief. So she followed the book's advice in not allowing it to drive her away. While she may not have left, she did tell Nick to knock it off. Rather than listening to her, only a couple of weeks after Dawn's death, Nick asked how she would respond if he said he wanted to take her upstairs and have sex with her. She told her pastor that that would be a sin and attempted to shut down his advances. On the whole, though, she brushed it off, reminding herself that it was just his grief talking and chose not to tell her husband about the incident.
The fact that Annette hadn't run for the hills was all Nick needed to convince himself he just had to keep trying.
No is not no, I guess.
Not to Nick or some of the other pastors we've talked about either. I mean, how could a woman actually know what she wanted if a man didn't force her to change her mind? Agency? What's that? So Nick kept coming on to her, and when he still hadn't worn her down, around a week later, he tried a different approach. Annette and Nick were at the gym when he tugged her into a tanning room and kissed her. He told Annette that God himself wanted them to have sex. When she reminded him that she was married, he replied that her vows were irrelevant. This was God's will. He went ahead and added that Christian love meant offering physical comfort to those, like one of God's servants, who had none. Annette believed that adultery was a sin, but she also believed that her pastor knew more than she did. So once he said that this didn't count as adultery, even though this clarification didn't really make sense to her, in a move she would later come to regret, she accepted his invitation to meet at a hotel. Although she didn't want to jeopardize her relationship with Craig for a man she didn't have strong feelings for, she had kissed Nick back and she still felt sorry for him. Besides, he said God only wanted them to have sex once.
He is a master manipulator.
and just a shit person.
And Annette was far from the only one to catch the widower's eye. In the months following his wife's death, Nick made the most of his newfound freedom by propositioning various female members of Christ Community Church. He came on to Nicole Matheson, whose husband had left her following a few of their marriage counseling sessions with Nick. Nick and Nicole started sleeping together in January 1998, only a month after Dawn's death. And Nick wasn't satisfied with just going after the women he was counseling by using the information he uncovered to widen the cracks in their marriage. He also pursued the 20-year-old daughter of Christ Community Church's founder, Pastor Bob, who just so happened to be one of the friends he went hunting with, Lindsay Latzbow, nay Lindsay Smith, which doesn't seem like the smartest choice.
You wouldn't think Bob would be thrilled.
Yeah. In the days after Dawn died and before Lindsay left to go on a 2-year mission trip to South Africa on December 31st, 1997, her relationship with Nick intensified. For around a year, they exchanged phone calls and emails in which they questioned how God could condone their behavior, professed their love, and fantasized about what they would do once they were together. That day came sooner rather than later when Nick went to Africa in 1998. A month passed during which the two were pretty hot and heavy, although they never went as far as to have sex. At the same time, he was chasing these other women. Nick hadn't ended his relationship with Sandy, who had split up from her husband of 12 years after a couple of Nick's life altering marriage counseling sessions.
Unaware of his other relationships and contrary to the original one time deal, Annette continued sleeping with Nick regularly. Nick's lust was so unstoppable that when Annette once told him she couldn't see him because she needed to stay home and keep an eye on her baby, Nick instructed her to drug her child with cold medicine to knock them out so she could leave.
Jesus.
The pastor's pull was so strong that Annette did as he said, and fortunately, her baby was left unharmed. But even if there were no adverse reactions, I don't feel like drugging your child so that you can go have sex is the ideal way to parent. But I don't have kids, so what do I know?
I don't think having kids is a prerequisite to common sense. Anything could have happened to the baby, and what if Craig had come home and saw his baby home alone? And people still wonder how Jim Jones got his followers to drink the Kool Aid.
All good points. But to be fair, it wasn't as if Annette was in a good place. Nick had said they had to keep their almighty approved relationship secret, and hiding her affair from her husband had taken its toll. The havoc it wreaked on her well being was so great that she considered Nick's manipulation a form of spiritual abuse.
With the women he went after, Nick would paint himself as the poor widower whose life and bed were empty without his wife. Nick would tailor his manipulation to each woman, sometimes offering spiritual counseling or a listening ear. At other times, like with Annette, Nick would say it was what the Lord wanted, or he would claim it was what he needed in the wake of his loss. And it worked. These women would offer Nick money or cheat on their husbands, all in an attempt to do the right thing. Nick was nothing if not convincing. His calling was to get people to believe him and have faith, after all. It would be years until these women learned that Nick had lied to them, used them, and brought them closer to hell than they thought it was possible to get on this mortal plane. One woman who was especially affected by Nick's story of grief was someone who was struggling with the very same loss, someone who was devastated by Dawn's death, someone who just so happened to be Dawn's mother. I sympathize with all the women manipulated by Nick, except for Sandy. She was a willing participant, in my opinion. But Dawn's mom, I'll withhold comments on her for a bit. But really, Nick, was the pool of women just getting smaller and smaller?
I actually did a double take when I first came across that fact, but I wonder if Nick saw Diana as a challenge. Like, am I such a master manipulator that I can even get the mother of the woman I murdered to fall for my act?
Yeah, I'm sure. Dawn was Diane Parmalee's only daughter. She found out about her death when her husband told her that Dawn died in a fire only hours after Diana had talked to her the evening before. In their last conversation, Dawn had mentioned that she had been ill and took some more Benadryl before heading to bed, never to speak to her mother again.
Nick had stayed in contact with Dawn's family in the months after her death. He was still a part of their lives and was always around when they needed him, such as when he helped with Darren's, one of Dawn's brothers, weddings or installed a new garage door for her parents. And whenever Nick was around, he seemed just as devastated by Dawn's death as Diana was. At the time, Diana thought she was helping Nick through his misery. She had no doubt that he loved her daughter. Diana remembered feeling awed by how quickly Nick had managed to compose a moving eulogy for Dawn's funeral after her sudden death. So, in her vulnerable state, she offered to be Dawn for him. Nick, though, didn't want that. He, twisted fuck that he is, wanted to be with, or in his words, love both Dawn and her mother. Diana now feels immense shame for sleeping with her son in law. She and the other women had no idea about his many relationships. But while he misled the other women by relying on his role within the church, to Diana, he played up his supposed sorrow. As opposed to Nick, though, Diana's pain was truly all consuming and unending. After her husband discovered her affair with Nick, they divorced, which also affected her relationship with her sons. Her world became so bleak that Diana even experienced suicidal thoughts.
Okay, I understand the all consuming grief, and I feel for her that her life fell apart and that she had suicidal thoughts. But it cringy, but she offered to be Dawn for him. I mean, I feel unwell. It's just gross. And how about comforting someone by, sharing thoughts of your loss or, I don't know, having some popcorn and watching a movie?
You're not going to hear me say those wouldn't have been better ideas, and it is so incredibly cringe. But Diana had no idea she was having sex with her daughter's killer. Yes, he was her son in law, but I honestly believe she was ripe for Nick's manipulation because of how vulnerable she was at the time.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. Like Diana, Annette went on to feel guilty for all that she had done in the course of her relationship with Nick. In the year that they were together, Annette became depressed. By early 1998, her husband Craig had noticed how low his wife had sunk. Watching his wife looking distressed as she isolated herself on their porch left Craig worried she would become suicidal in the wake of Dawn's death. What Craig didn't know was that the secret of her infidelity was slowly eating away at her. Ultimately, though, Nick was the one to end it at the same time he broke off the rest of his relationships. Had he suddenly grown a conscience? No. By the end of 1998, he had chosen one woman to dedicate himself to, Nicole Matheson, the woman who had formerly been counseled with her then husband by Nick.
No longer cheating on her husband, Annette gradually began seeing friends and family more often, and she started to feel a bit better. That said, Annette's shame never stopped simmering under the surface of her marriage. And it came to a boil a few years after Nick called it quits when she learned about his relationship with Sandy, cementing her niggling fear that their affair had never been orchestrated by God. This revelation hit all the harder because Annette had previously gone to Nick for advice about their affair, because who else did she have to turn to? And he had told her to contact Sandy, whom he had still been sleeping with at the same time. Annette and Sandy hadn't been close friends, but Nick insisted that Sandy would help her deal with the feelings that the infidelity he had instigated was stirring up. Given Nick's job and Sandy's prophecies, Annette knew they each had a special relationship with God. So she believed she could trust them, despite the whispers about the relationship echoing off the church's walls.
And once Annette learned the truth about the pastor and the prophetess in the spring of 2001, she revealed her own affair in a moment of passion. She had been arguing with Craig about Nick when he came to their pastor's defense. Annette wanted her husband to understand that Nick wasn't the man they had both thought he was. Craig, who had never had any inkling that anything had been going on between his wife and Nick, was shocked when Annette clarified that she wasn't just upset about Nick sleeping with Sandy, she was horrified to hear her husband defending a man she knew far better than he did. So she told him exactly how close she and Nick had become. Craig was understandably furious with both of them. He had been lied to over and over again, and he couldn't stand the thought of Nick doing the same to anyone else. By the time that Craig discovered Nick's true character, Christ Community Church had separated into two different churches. Pastor Robert Biley Craig was still holding hours long animated sermons at the old location, whereas Pastor Bob had started a new church that Nick soon joined in a nearby town. So Craig asked for a meeting with Bob. Also in attendance at this meeting was Sandy Glass.
Nick had called Sandy the evening before to tell her that he knew she had admitted their affair. When she told him she was going to the authorities and that he should do the same, he asked if she thought that was what God wanted. She wasn't sure, but she decided that she still needed to speak. So, in the middle of the meeting the next day, Sandy held up a hand. Having gained the attention of everyone in the room, which included Annette and some of the other female congregants Nick had chased after, she admitted that she hadn't only cheated on her husband with Nick. The pastor's sins hadn't simply left behind dirty sheets and ruined relationships. They had left someone dead. It had been 3.5 years since Dawn's death when Sandy learned Craig was ready to reveal her affair with Nick. Whether her true motivation came from the counseling she had undergone and the conversations she had had, or the realization that it was going to come out either way, the urge to come clean overtook Sandy, and she had far more to confess to than cheating. So she called a criminal defense attorney and set up a meeting with the Bremerton police. The case had long been closed, but all of a sudden, investigators were given information that had them rethinking their initial conclusions.
Sue Schultz had been a patrol officer with the Bremerton Police Department at the time of Dawn's assumed accidental death. But now, Detective Schultz was put on the very case when Sandy Glass came forward to confess the affair she had been having with the then married Nick throughout the summer and autumn of 1997. Sandy didn't hold back. She explained that over the course of their relationship, the pair had discussed the deaths of both their spouses. Sandy had believed that God had told her that her carpenter husband, Jimmy, was marked for death in 1992. After Jimmy failed to drop dead, Sandy realized she'd need to take a more hands on approach. 5 years later, when Sandy had recounted her plan to kill her husband to Nick, he said he'd give her instructions about how to go about it, but wouldn't physically help her commit the murder. So Sandy indulged her own murderous impulses and considered the specifics, such as when exactly she'd do the deed. Her full plan had been to drive into a tree while her husband and 4 boys were in the car, killing him but leaving her and the kids alive. Thankfully, in a later conversation with Nick, she told him that she hadn't done it. And if one of her kids had died, would that have been okay? Just collateral damage?
I get that wasn't the goal, but I feel like that should have at least been a consideration.
Should have been.
Ultimately, Sandy left Jimmy before Dawn's death in 1997 with faith that her prophecy would come to pass. Sandy was so sure that she would soon be the next Mrs. Hackney that she and Nick went well beyond imagining unwrapping Christmas presents as a couple. She admitted to authorities that they went so far as to buy each other engagement rings. But after Dawn didn't die on December 18th, Sandy rang Nick the following morning, sobbing over God having misled them.
So, was it God's fault?
Yeah, he told her Dawn would die that day. When he didn't smite her lover's wife, he let Sandy down. All wasn't lost, though. God rekindled their hope when he gave Sandy a new prophecy. She had been praying when God told her that Nick was free to kill Dawn himself. However, we do have to mention that Detective Schultz investigated Sandy and doesn't believe she knew that Nick planned to kill his wife, which puts this new prophecy's existence into question. We can't know for sure if Sandy knew beforehand or not, but there's no doubt that she was one of the first to find out about the murder after the fact. Because only 8 days later, December 26th ended with Dawn dead. Hours after she was gone, Nick phoned Sandy to tell her it's done. In the days after Dawn's memorial service, Nick said he and Sandy needed to press pause. Whether that was so he would have more time to sleep with other women, or because he was worried about how it would look, only Nick knows. But his confidence must only have grown when no one went to the police, not even Pastor Robert Biley Craig, who had previously told Nick he needed to stop seeing Sandy. Biley had been suspicious of Nick, but he wasn't coming forward without prompting, and neither was anyone else. At least, not in the beginning.
Over 3 years later, though Sandy told the police how a couple of weeks after his wife's death, Nick had divulged how it all went down. Nick had been lying awake on the morning of December 26, 1997, when God had instructed him to take the land. This phrase from the Old Testament was interpreted by Christ Community Church as encouragement to take what they wanted. So Nick took it to mean he should give his wife another dose of Benadryl. Knowing she had already taken some herself, Nick had previously explained the high amount of a combined result of Dawn getting up to take more and being sensitive to its effects. But in reality, Nick had given Dawn an excessive amount to avoid a struggle when he suffocated her, relying on the diphenhydramine to knock her out. Sandy recounted to authorities how Nick had suffocated his incapacitated wife by putting a plastic bag over her head, then he immediately lit the fire to hide the evidence. Horrifyingly, he added that Dawn had been conscious in her final moments as her husband held the plastic over her face as she desperately tried to breathe. I mean, that's a special kind of evil to murder someone in such a hands on way.
Especially knowing that they must be terrified and confused because they trusted you.
Yeah.
Contrary to Nick's unbelievable story, the new information made a lot more sense. Nick had bought the propane canisters with the intent of using them in the fire.
You don't say.
It's shocking, I know. On Christmas, he put the canisters in the bedroom beside the electric space heater and placed the wrapping paper in front of it to serve as kindling. Having given his wife Benadryl, he used the plastic bag to cut off her oxygen before lighting the fire in the very room he left his wife's body. Once Dawn was dead, he could, and did, devote his time and energy to having sex with other women without fear of any repercussions. And investigators didn't only have Sandy's word to rest their case on. It's true that Detective Sue Schultz and lead detective Dan Trudeau didn't have a body or really any physical evidence left to examine. The propane canisters, for instance, were long gone, but that didn't mean they had no way left of finding answers. Remember that Dr. Lexina thought one of the propane tanks could have exploded and led to a flash fire that caused John's throat to close? Well, the two detectives reached out to propane companies and other experts to ask if that could happen. The response? No way. The propane canisters would have had safety valves to prevent them from leaking or exploding. The flash fire wasn't the reason Dawn's lungs didn't have soot in them.
Nearly 4 years after Dawn's death in September 2001, Nicholas Hackney was charged with first-degree premeditated murder in the course of first-degree arson. Nick was taken to the police station and interviewed by Detective Schultz and Trudeau. Once they were all seated, the ever personable pastor, Nick, chose to refer to them by their first names, attempting to take control of the conversation and turn the interrogation into a friendly chat. In spite of his nice guy demeanor, Detective Schultz saw him as the master manipulator that he was, which I love. His supposed charms didn't work on people not in his flock.
You would sure hope that it wouldn't work on the detectives interviewing him, but I guess that's not a given.
Narcissist that he was, he
Yeah.
thought that was going to work on everybody, I guess. As for the women he had manipulated, when speaking about Sandy's immunity deal, Detective Schultz firmly rejected the idea that Sandy or any of the other women were anything other than victims of Nick's, who exhibited poor judgment. After all, there was no evidence that Sandy had helped Nick commit the murder. She had been at home with her entire family the morning in question.
Annette might have been disillusioned with Nick after learning about his affair with Sandy, but she was still shocked to learn of his arrest. As you would expect, it was even worse for Diana. Police informed her of Nick's arrest on September 12th, 2001. As people across the country were grappling with loss and panic from the terrorist attack the day before, Diana was reeling from the news that her daughter hadn't died accidentally. She had been murdered by her husband. The man Diana knew, the man she later slept with, couldn't have done such a thing. Having fooled so many of those around him, the charismatic pastor still liked his odds. With Nick's rejection of the prosecution's plea deal of a 7-year sentence, all of Nick's claims would be put to the test in court. Nick's trial began on November 4th, 2002, at the Kitsap County Courthouse with Judge Anna Laurie presiding. Even before she stepped into the courtroom, prosecutor Claire Bradley knew she had her work cut out for her. The accidental death ruling had hindered the investigation, and this same lack of evidence now threatened her case. And although Dr. Emmanuel Lexina, who had been the Kitsap County medical examiner at the time of Dawn's death, was ready to contradict the ruling he made in 1998 by calling it a homicide, the jury would be all too eager to scrutinize what made him change his mind. Sandy's statement.
Also, problematically, by the time the trial rolled around, WSP crime laboratory toxicologist Egil Weiss had unexpectedly died. The prosecution needed someone to testify and explain the results. Enter Dr. Barry Logan. Since he was Egil Weiss's supervisor when she did her analysis in 1997, he had also signed her report. So he was more than up to the task of explaining the procedures WSP Crime Laboratory followed when testing samples. Despite Nick's objections, the death investigation toxicology report was admitted. In addition to Dr. Logan, Dr. Emmanuel Laxima and Dr. Daniel Seelove used the late toxicologist's report to describe how Dawn had suffocated to death before the fire even began.
Dr. Seelove testified that the fire investigative reports concluded that the scene reflected arson rather than a flash fire, which was backed up by experts who testified that there had never been any reported leakage when it came to the propane canisters Nick had. Having taken into account Sandy's statement of Nick confessing to having killed Dawn with a plastic bag, in opposition to Dr. Laxina's initial conclusion that Dawn's larynx must have spasmed, Dr. Seelove stated that the pulmonary edema foam supported death from asphyxia due to the bag, as did the findings of no soot, carbon monoxide, or propane that showed she wasn't alive when the fire started. While he acknowledged that without forensic evidence, he could only base his opinion that a plastic bag had been used on Sandy's word, Dr. Seelove stuck to his ruling of asphyxia without knowing what led to it. Repeating Nick's confession to the court, the woman in question testified for the prosecution, along with Annette and Craig Anderson, pastors Robert Biley Craig and Bob Smith, and Lindsay Latzbow. To discredit Sandy's damning testimony, Nick's defense claimed that she made everything up after she found out that Nick intended to marry Nicole Matheson. One of the public defenders on Nick's case, Aaron Towney, used Sandy's own admission of her prophecies being indistinguishable from her desires to show the one she had of Dawn dying in a new, more incriminating light. He also highlighted the timeline of when she confessed, which was only after Craig was going to reveal their affair. Instead of being seen as complicit in Dawn's murder, by pointing the finger squarely at Nick once her involvement was about to come out, she became another one of his victims.
Luckily, the prosecution's argument in favor of Sandy wasn't just a blanket denial of the defense's claim. They had proof of some of the details Sandy said Nick had shared with her. When Nick had recounted exactly how he had committed and covered up the murder, he had told Sandy that he hadn't just left the wrapping paper as kindling. The few photographs of the crime scene clearly showed the newspapers Nick had placed all over the bed Dawn was laying on that he had boasted to Sandy about. It also wasn't as if the entire case rested on Sandy's word. But if you thought her prophecies were a lot to get your head around, buckle up because we're about to discuss the timeline. Fire investigator Scott Roberts testified that the extensive damage to the bedroom would have only occurred once the fire turned into an open flame, which would have burned for 60 minutes or less. After the Hackney's neighbor called firefighters at 7:13 a.m., first responders managed to get there in 5 minutes. One of the firefighters on the scene, Joel Wolf, recounted how it took around 7 or 8 minutes to suppress the fire in the bedroom. Another firefighter named Dana Normandy said he arrived a few minutes after the initial firefighters, spent a couple of minutes searching the home, then went into the bedroom and saw that the fire had been put out. All in all, the fire was extinguished around 7:25 a.m. This meant that the earliest the fire could have started was around 6:25, leaving it, who the prosecution believed set out at 6:45, much later than he said he had, more than enough time to light it.
His hunting partners from that morning backed up Nick leaving at this later time. Lindsay testified that the three met at the Hood Canal Bridge between 7 and 7:15 that morning. She added that by the time they got to the hunting blinds, there was enough light so that they could see without their flashlights. She and Nick typically tried to time their arrival to their preferred hunting spots a few minutes before daylight broke. So they usually got there by sunrise instead of at the legal shooting time when it was still too dark to see well enough to shoot. The third member of this trio, Phil, confirmed that they got to the blinds a couple of minutes before dawn, well after the legal shooting time of 7:28 on December 26, 1997. Having established the approximate time of his arrival, the prosecution needed to estimate how long the journey to where Nick, Lindsay, and Phil went duck hunting on Indian Island would take. Detective Robert Davis told the jury that it took him 28 minutes to get to the Hood Canal Bridge from the Hackney's home and another 23 minutes to get from the bridge to Indian Island, so a little less than an hour in total. Detective Davis didn't go to the actual hunting site or the duck blinds, but this test was enough to learn that Nick would have left home around 6:45 to arrive at the hunting blinds a little before dawn.
But as you'd expect, Nick later provided information to discredit the timeline, such as a Google map that displayed a distance of 41 miles from his home to Indian Island that would have taken an hour and 13 minutes, well over the 51 minutes Detective Davis estimated. His defense even recorded a reenactment in which two men and the person filming left Nick and Dawn's home at 6:45 in the morning, drove to where Nick stopped for coffee, then to the bridge where Lindsay climbed in, before finally arriving where Nick and Phil parked and walked to the blinds on Indian Island. This 1 hour and 14-minute recorded journey supported the Google Map estimate. Using that and going off the image from a webcam installed years later to contend that dawn that day first began to break between 6:45 and 7. Nick's defense argued that the trio had to have arrived at the blinds by 7 that morning, which contradicts Lindsay's claim that they met at the bridge between 7 and 7:15. This contrary timeline meant that Nick had to have left his home by 5:56, too early to have started the fire.
Yet, Nick himself had previously poked holes in his exculpatory story, because on January 2nd, 1998, he had informed his insurance company, Safeco, that he had driven away from his house at 5:10 in the morning. And using this new evidence, that would have meant that he had gotten to the blinds around 6:30, well before there would have been enough light to have not needed flashlights. Sweeping their client's inconsistencies under the rug, Nick's defense attorneys found an expert to support Nick's more convenient claim that he left around 6. Jim White stated that the fire started around 7 and burned for about 20 minutes, which meant Nick couldn't have started it because he had left the house more than an hour before the blaze began. Okay, timeline talk over. Basically, what I took away from that truckload of information is that only the prosecution's theory matches up with Lindsay and Phil's statements. Beyond discrediting his former friend's narrative, Nick's defense also made sure to mention that there were no signs of strangulation on Dawn's neck from the plastic bag, and that the level of Benadryl could have gone up because of the changes in Dawn's body after her death. As for his motive, after the defense failed to get testimony about the pastor's habit of using his congregation as a dating pool excluded, they pivoted by saying that Nick may be a cheater, but that didn't mean he was a murderer.
Prosecutor Claire Bradley, on the other hand, laid out Nick's many motives for murder. First, divorce wasn't an option for a pastor of Christ Community Church. Beyond losing his leadership role, Nick could have been excommunicated, and if he had been kicked out, Nick wouldn't be able to use his trusted position as pastor to prey upon the women in his congregation. Second, Dawn had increased her life insurance coverage before she died, which Nick knew all about. But what he wasn't aware of was that this raise wouldn't be reflected until January 1st, days after her death. Still, between their homeowner's insurance and Dawn's life insurance through the credit union, Nick wouldn't be hurting financially if his wife and home were no longer in the picture. Third, although Nick may have been getting off with numerous women, he had gotten serious, engagement ring serious, with Sandy. And as eccentric as the church was, we don't think bigamy was part of their belief system. After the trial had played out for nearly 2 months at the Kitsap County Superior Court on December 26, 2002, 5 years to the day since Dawn's death, and I really love the karma of when the anniversary of a death coincides with the conviction date.
It is satisfyingly poetic.
The jury convicted Nicholas Hackney of first-degree murder and found him guilty by special verdict of committing that murder in the course of first-degree arson. This aggravating factor resulted in a life sentence without the possibility of parole.
As they usually do, Nick maintained his innocence and appealed by raising various issues, including that the jury wasn't properly instructed regarding the aggravating factor of arson, and that there wasn't enough evidence for him to have been convicted of committing the murder in the course of arson. Although the state court of appeals had previously ruled that the jury had been properly instructed that one crime must have caused the other for the murder to have been committed in the course of arson, and that Dawn's murder was connected to the arson to the extent that it was committed in the course of arson, that decision didn't hold up for long. In a surprising twist, on May 31st, 2007, the Washington Supreme Court upheld Nick's conviction, but vacated the aggravating factor of committing murder in the course of first degree arson. They ruled that the death must be a probable consequence of the felony. And because Dawn's murder occurred before and was not caused by the arson, remember the lack of soot in her lungs, Nick did not commit her murder in the course of arson. With the Washington Supreme Court having reversed the ruling of the Court of Appeals, 37-year-old Nick, who had been behind bars for nearly 7 years, was up for resentencing.
That's infuriating. He committed arson to cover up the murder. I mean, potato, potato.
I wasn't going to include this, but that's pretty much what one of the dissenting judges said, because for real.
Well, I like him.
Yeah.
Without the aggravating factor, Nick was looking at 240 to 320 months in prison for first-degree murder. Having been transferred from the Monroe Correctional Complex to the Kitsap County Jail for his resentencing hearing on June 20th, 2008, Nick was led into the second-floor courtroom of the Kitsap County Courthouse in Port Orchard, Washington, in belly chains and a reddish-orange jumpsuit. Like his mother's supportive choice to wear a shirt the same color as her son's mandated uniform. I mean, that's a new one, matching your outfit to your son's jail attire.
It's hard not to think that was intentional.
From the beginning, Nick's father, Dan Hackney, a mechanic, had been fighting for his son's release right alongside his appellate lawyers. He believed Don's death to have been an accident, which Nick had gone down for because of Sandy Glass. Damn Jezebel, poor little Nicky is innocent.
All those sluts intent on bringing good men down?
In the 11 years since Dawn's murder, Sandy had divorced Jimmy in 2002 and married her high school sweetheart, Scott Nickel. When Scott tried to shake Dan's hand, Dan ignored it. Sandy herself was absent from the courtroom. She felt that her involvement in the case had ended when she testified for the prosecution in 2002. Someone else who had decided not to come to the proceedings was Nicole Matheson. The woman for whom Nick had ended all his other relationships had responded in kind by divorcing the husband she had been in Nick's counseling sessions with and married Nick in 2005. Even though she had defended her then fiance when he was convicted, Nicole and Nick would soon divorce during his ongoing incarceration in 2011.
While some had actively avoided the resentencing hearing, Annette Anderson had driven all the way from her and Craig's new home in Oregon to read the letter in which she described the continuing consequences of Nick's crime. She felt it was her duty as a former member of Christ Community Church to speak on Dawn's behalf. But Nick's defense attorney, Mankiewicz, argued that Annette wasn't even related to Dawn and shouldn't be allowed to read a victim impact statement. Although Annette may have been kept silent, Dawn's younger brother, Dennis Tianhara, was able to speak, and he used his chance to argue for the maximum sentence alongside the prosecution, 26 years, pleading that Nick shouldn't get to spend more of his life outside of prison than Dawn had to walk this earth.
Here, here, I agree with him.
Who, besides Nick, wouldn't? Donald Tianhara, Dawn's father, was understandably visibly upset as he listened to Nick's defense attorney name the charity drives, pastoring, and legal aid Nick had organized for his fellow inmates from behind bars. As Donald so aptly put it, he's doing good things in prison, and that's fine. Keep him there.
I am a big fan of Dennis and Donald.
Aren't we all?
Fortunately, he got his wish when Anna Laurie, the same judge who presided over Nick's trial, resentenced him to 26 years and 8 months in prison. Yet, this new sentence carried the possibility of parole, meaning Nick might only serve 16 to 19 years before getting out on parole. This year, in 2025, Sandy may have been able to save herself from a life behind bars by coming forward and making a deal with the prosecution. But Dawn's mother, Diana, thinks Sandy's desire to be with Nick is the reason her daughter is dead. Like Biley, she believes her prophecies came from Satan. More inclined to find a less supernatural solution, Detective Sue Schultz wouldn't have put it past Nick to have been the one to convince Sandy that she was having prophecies about the spouse's death when that was really what he wanted. But she also acknowledged that the members of Christ Community Church did believe in prophecies. We'd also point out that Sandy had believed her husband would die in 1992, long before her affair with Nick began.
Having previously said he felt like a man who just got his life back, Nick's life has certainly taken a turn, but not a full 180-degree twist. He's still preaching, just on a new subject: prison reform via sustainability. In 2010, the Sustainability in Prisons Project contributed to the formation of a group of prison staff and inmates who discovered that the Monroe Correctional Complex spent nearly $65,000 per year disposing of food waste. After he learned about vermiculture composting in a male correspondence class on sustainability, Nick, among others, developed a program in which composting worms would take care of some of this waste to save money and help the environment.
I only ever heard the word permaculture. I mean, that's kind of interesting. The Pacific Northwest has a long history of taking action to protect the environment.
It's true. This led Nick to come to the conclusion that sustainability projects in prison can reduce recidivism by giving inmates the tools and motivation needed to change destructive behavior patterns. all by reintroducing purpose to their lives. So, while incarcerated, Nick co founded the Environmental Advancement Reintegration Network, EARN, which helps prisoners create businesses aimed at providing climate solutions once released.
Now at the Washington Correction Center in Shelton, Nick aims to reach a larger audience with his writing, such as when he wrote for The Appeal, a nonprofit news organization, in June 2023. With his release date looming after over 20 years behind bars, he explained that his excitement about getting out was dulled by his concern for the lack of long term care for released convicts.
And I have thoughts.
Oh, good, me too.
On the one hand, institutionalization is real. What springs to mind is the tragic depiction of this problem in Gillian McAllister's The Evidence Against You. While it is a work of fiction, the main character's father is imprisoned for murdering her mother, and as with all her books, my heart continued to ache for some of the characters even after I finished the final page.
That's a good association. That is a really good book. And I kept thinking about it for days later. It's a thought provoking and sad. And though I had all kinds of sympathy for the imprisoned Gabe in the book, I do not sympathize with Nick.
Same. But I would agree that in general, the US justice system does not prioritize rehabilitation, which, in my opinion, should be the goal for many, although I wouldn't go as far as to say all offenders. The famous case study for this is Norway, since when the country redesigned its prison system in the 1990s to focus on rehabilitation and reintegration, it cut recidivism down by almost 20%, and it still has one of the lowest reconviction rates in the world.
Yeah, and Norway actually tries to prepare inmates for life after release by focusing on education, housing, job opportunities, and mental health and substance abuse care. And of course, healthcare costs are minimal there. On the other hand, the US has many for profit prisons, and because of overcrowding and lack of funds designated for actually helping inmates reintegrate into society, they often reoffend because they're unable to find a job, a place to live, or to function in society at all.
You can't expect someone to turn their life around if all you've essentially done is put them in an equally bad or worse situation than the one they started out in. But on the other hand, doesn't prison have to be about punishment to some extent? Otherwise, how are we giving victims and their families justice?
I think so. There has to be consequences for your actions. Yes, victims and their families need justice, but the person committing a crime has to face punishment too.
And that doesn't mean improvement shouldn't be made to ensure the punishment prisoners face isn't cruel or unusual, much as I might fantasize about that in certain instances. But my heart isn't bleeding for Nick.
Agree. I don't think we should model an El Salvadorian prison as an ideal example, but I also don't think good behavior and starting a sustainable business means your crime is somehow less. I don't mean white collar crime or, low level drug offenses. I mean murder, as two wrongs don't make a right. Doing something right doesn't absolve the wrong,
Very well put. And Nick has never admitted to killing Dawn or shown any remorse.
which should be a requirement for parole.
Uh-huh. He plans to resume preaching upon his release, but he at least won't be going back to Christ Community Church because the original building was sold. As for its other leaders, Pastor Bob Smith died in 2021 at the age of 73, and Pastor Robert Biley Craig is now the head of a church in Gig Harbor, Washington.
Life has moved on for the others in Nick's orbit as well, even though his trial led Diana to question religious leaders like him and to feel even guiltier for getting involved with them. Her faith has never wavered. She believes that the devil puts evil in the hearts of men. Again, I'm not religious, but what about free will? The devil didn't make him murder his wife.
You know I'm with you.
She takes comfort in the knowledge that Dawn is safe from it all in heaven. Fittingly, Dawn's tombstone in Cherry Grove Memorial Park reads, "Forever dwelling in God's arms and in our hearts." Ultimately, the church that Annette and Craig Anderson joined to support their growing family almost tore it apart. In the end, though, like Diana, they didn't give up on their faith or their family. Craig credits God's forgiving nature as the reason he was able to forgive Annette. They may have grown more skeptical of those in power in religious institutions,
which, in my opinion, is a plus.
definitely, but they went on to find a different church, one hopefully free from pastors like Nick Hackney. And I'm glad that they're still together and that Craig was able to forgive Annette. I really do think she was vulnerable and like catnip for Nick.
Absolutely. And no one's arguing that Nick wasn't a piece of human garbage. But I feel for Diana and Annette. I don't love all of their choices, but I agree that they were manipulated and probably wouldn't have acted in the way they did had Nick not been in their lives.
I agree.
That said, I'm a bit more conflicted about Sandy. I don't think she helped murder Dawn, and I could believe that Nick was the only one to want his wife dead. But given Sandy's prophecies about her own husband and her plan to kill him, I could also buy into the idea that she too, at least theoretically, wanted them both out of the way. That doesn't mean she should have been prosecuted, but it also doesn't mean she was completely innocent.
I don't think she helped murder Dawn. I also don't think she was vulnerable and easily manipulated like Annette and Diane and other women in Nick's orbit. I think she decided she wanted Nick, so her prophecies foretold events that would align with her goal.
I think that's the most likely possibility. Next week, we'll be continuing our series on religious leaders who kill family members when we discuss the case of Stephen Allwine.
All the sources we use for this episode are in the show notes below. If you'd like to suggest a case or theme for us to discuss, feel free to email us at terrifyinglytypicalpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us at Terrifyingly Typical Podcast on Instagram and at Terrifyingly Typical Pod on TikTok. Leave us a comment below to let us know what you thought of the case. We'd love to hear your opinions.
See you next week.